Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to be having a think about one of Schubert's most glorious pieces written for the piano. Now, he wrote a set of 4 impromptus. They're catalogued as D899, and these date from 1827, and we're going to be thinking about the third of those impromptus, which comes in the beautiful key of G flat major with 6 flats. So that's something that often puts pianists off, but actually once you get into it, it's absolutely fine. And if you're a pianist who's thinking, I'd love to play that piece, but I can't bring myself to think about playing something in 6 flats, well, here's the good news. I always think actually the hardest keys to deal with are the keys sort of in the middle, you know, when you've got 4 or 5 flats or sharps. C major, of course, is nice and easy at the level of having no sharps and no flats. But if you think about it, right round the other end of the circle of fifths, if you're in C flat major, everything's flat. If you're in C sharp major, everything's sharp, so you don't really have to worry about it in the same kind of way because you just think that everything's flat or everything's sharp. Now, if you've got something like this where you've got 6 flats, well, the question is, which is the one note that isn't flat? And in this key, of course, it's F. So you can sort of think, well, everything's flat except for F. And if you think of it that way, you don't spend your whole time burning up energy thinking, oh my goodness, there's another new note and is this one flat? You just think, everything's flat unless it's an F. Unless, of course, Schubert tells us something else. So what is this piece? And you may well find that it's quite familiar to you. And so it goes on. Absolutely beautiful piece. So what's going on? How does Schubert really engage with the emotions of the listener through this piece? Because it's gorgeous. Let's start by thinking about melody, because Schubert, of course, is the great songwriter. So if he's the great songwriter, well, we know that because he can write such beautiful melodies. Well, let's see what's so beautiful about this melody. It goes B flat and sits there for ages. Then it goes B flat, then it goes B flat, then it goes B flat. So you might be thinking, well, if I wanted to write a really fantastic, emotional, memorable melody, would I just start off with a load of B flats and quite a lot of long notes? This is what's clever about Schubert, because most of us would be defeated by that. Well, how do you turn that into a gorgeous melody? Well, of course, what he does is he has this first B flat that's quite long, and then he repeats it, but at a faster speed, and takes us to this note, and then he moves. So when you move on to that next melody, that's quite telling, isn't it? That B flat coming down to the G flat. So it's kind of the simplest possible melodic design, isn't it? To have these repeated B flats. But then there's something rather telling about this falling third at the end of it. And having started off with what doesn't seem to have a lot to say melodically, of course, that simple first statement then starts to grow. So when we look at the melody for the next phrase, we think, oh, suddenly things are a bit more mobile, both in terms of pitch and in terms of rhythm. So the second phrase, aha, so we really have a pair of phrases, don't we? This very simple thing with a repeated note just falling a third at the end, and then the next phrase that's a kind of answer to it, kind of going somewhere, traveling, taking us in a new direction. Okay, well, what does Schubert do next? Well, believe it or not, he then goes back and does that repeated thing again. So you're thinking, oh my goodness, how does he get away with all these repeated notes twice? Well, this time, what does he do? This is exactly the same as he did the first time round. And he goes on falling that third as he did the first time, but now he goes on an extra note and extends the phrase And then we have this lovely finish to the melody. So it's quite clever, isn't it? Very simple design. So that's got something to tell us as composers, if that's where we're coming from. Sometimes you're working really hard to get a fantastic melody. Actually, sometimes there's beauty in simplicity. And this idea of the repeated note and then something that moves on and grows from those repeated notes is really what Schubert is up to. Well, what does he do? That's taking us to this point, which is the kind of opening statement, where you've basically got one phrase, an answering phrase, go back through the first phrase, but this time sort of keep it going. So that's an interesting design as well, and it pulls you forward emotionally. Well, next thing is he has a new phrase that's saying something different. And then he builds on that phrase, so you see what now happens in the next phrase. Slight different rhythm there. Otherwise, it's the same rhythm, and it's used in sequence, isn't it? So it's gone up a third on the previous phrase, and then we have a different phrase on this bottom line. And then that carries on. And then... So you've got this kind of little 5-note kind of closing figure, haven't you, at the bottom of this page? And then he uses that again. So there's the kind of first section of the piece. So you see that there's real simplicity in the melodic design, but isn't it clever how Schubert has this balance between being quite static pitch-wise and then generating movement? How he kind of allows for stillness and for forward movement in the rhythm and in terms of how he generates the pitch. How sometimes you have a phrase that answers the previous phrase, how sometimes you repeat a previous phrase and extend it forwards, how you sometimes use sequence, but when you use sequence, it's not absolutely identical sequence, slightly modified just by sometimes a little detail. And then how you go on to generate another phrase that's got a slightly different design. This time, this phrase on the bottom here, where you start with a long note, and then you have this sort of 5-note figure, which then gets used again. So clever different ways of spinning a melodic line that kind of keeps you guessing, but at the same time kind of captivates you. Well, it's true to say that actually, if you just had this melody, I don't think you'd be completely blown away by this piece. So there are other things going on as well. And of course, what's interesting and the great skill, the great genius of the piece is how Schubert combines that knack for writing a melody with the other things that are going on. So let's now have a look at some of the harmony of the piece, which is supporting that melody. So if we go back to the beginning, we're in G flat major. So the whole of the first bar is a G flat major chord. It's just a tonic chord. So that's another interesting bit of kind of static stuff, isn't it? Because we've got repeated B flats. So you think, okay, well, if you're going to repeat the same note in the melody, surely you're going to change the chord. So you might start off by doing something like this. So at least we've got some harmonic movement. Actually, Schubert says, well, we might do a bit of that sort of thing later, but we just want it all to be kind of calm and serene at the beginning, and let's just take our time enjoying the tonic chord. So he does that for the first bar, the first measure, but then you feel this change of colour as we go into the second measure, the second bar, because then he goes to spend the whole of this bar with a chord of E flat minor. So that's an interesting move because E flat minor is chord 6 in G flat major. Of course, E flat minor is the relative minor key of G flat major. I'm not suggesting for a moment that he's modulating to E flat minor, but nevertheless using the first 2 bars, the first 2 measures, to set up that polarity between G flat major and its relative minor. Is quite an interesting thing to do. You certainly hear the change of colour between this bright major chord at the beginning and then this minor chord that follows, and particularly because of the slow moving harmonic rhythm, you've got time to kind of soak that up, haven't you? And there's a stillness about it because the melody is just repeating those notes. The harmony's moving very slowly, 1 chord per bar at the moment. Okay, now we said when we come on to the next line, into the third bar, the third measure, the melody kind of picks up. It picks up in rhythm, picks up in pitch direction. Well, so does the harmonic rhythm. So it's interesting that those things match up. So what have we got in this bar, this measure? Well, we've got this chord, which is really a chord 2 in its first inversion. And then in the second half of the bar, we've got a new chord. So the harmonic rhythm is going at twice the pace in the third measure, the third bar, than it was in the first 2. And what have we got now? We've really got a 5 chord. It's basically a dominant chord, but there are things going on because in the melody we've got this G flat, which is an accented passing note or an accented passing tone going to a harmony, and then a passing note or a passing tone again. And right at the end of this bar, this measure, you notice that Schubert just reorganizes the dominant chord into a dominant 7th, and furthermore a dominant 7th in its last inversion. So we have a kind of power that comes out of that dominant 7th in its last inversion, which then resolves to the tonic chord in first inversion. And then you think, okay, it's going to have some kind of fairly straightforward 1/5 cadence now. Actually, he does something a bit more colourful because he does this. Because when you look at this, you suddenly think, oh, that's a colour chord, isn't it? And we've got this C natural in it. And then he goes to a D flat major chord. Okay, well, D flat major chord doesn't take us too much by surprise because it's chord 5 in the key of G flat major. So this is an imperfect cadence. That's perfectly fair enough. But by using this C natural before, C natural, of course, is contradicting our home key, isn't it, of G flat major. We should be having a C flat. So if you put a C natural in there, it's suggesting a movement to the key of D flat major. And the chord is C, E flat, G flat, B flat. So that's a 7/7 in D flat major. It's not a diminished 7th, it's a 7/7. So do you see what's going on? He's kind of creating this impression that, well, we're having this cadence finishing on the dominant chord of G flat major, but there's also this hint of, oh, have we modulated to D flat major, to the dominant key? Or is this some kind of secondary dominant replacement? We're not going 5/1 or 5/7/1. We're going 7/7/1. So it's an interesting bit of coloration, really. I think that's what it is. I don't think it's really a modulation. He's just saying, here's a bit of colour where you hear the C natural going to D flat. But he's immediately going to pull us back to G flat major at the beginning of this next bar. So you see where we're going back to bass again. Well, that makes sense that the harmony is going back to what it was on the first line, because so is the melody. But not before another gorgeous little touch occurs, which is both melodic and harmonic. We've got our D flat major chord at the end of that phrase. And then you notice right at the end of that measure, the end of that bar, Schubert goes A natural. Ooh, now what's happened there? We've got a D flat major chord, that dominant chord, and by turning A flat into A natural, it makes that chord augmented. So you feel the pull, that emotion of the, oh, it was a major chord, now it's augmented. Now, the A natural is pulling us on to B flat. So you feel what it's doing melodically. We've arrived on A flat. The A natural is pulling us forwards to B flat, taking us, drawing us into the beginning of the next phrase. So it's not one of those cadences where everything stops and then we think, oh, right, here's the next phrase, on we go. He uses that A natural to pull us forwards and tip us into the next phrase, which is rather gorgeous. So melodically, it's quite telling, but harmonically, it has that impact of turning that D flat major chord into a D flat augmented chord. and then on we go again. And then when we get to the third line, of course, well, what's happening here? We're kind of rerunning what we did at the beginning. So we then go back to that slower harmonic rhythm. So that's kind of quite, it puts us back at ease again, doesn't it? Enables us to relax a little bit for a moment. Onto that E flat minor chord again that we spoke of before. And then you notice that he has this chord right at the end of this line. And with that D natural in there, this makes it a dominant seventh in E flat minor. Okay, well, that's no big surprise. E flat minor is the relative minor of G flat major, so that's perfectly in order. And when we have a dominant seventh, it tends to resolve either to chord 1 or to chord 6. So, you know, where's this one going? At the beginning of the next line, it goes on to a C flat major chord. So that's really chord 6 in E flat minor, isn't it? But in G flat major, you've also got to think, well, that's kind of chord 4, isn't it? So you see what he's doing, giving us a bit of harmonic colour that's giving us a push across the line change to that chord. So it's kind of using the formula for an interrupted cadence, 5/7 to 6, though it isn't a cadence, it's just using that formula. And then he says, well, we're not really going to E flat minor, that's just chord 4 in the original key of G flat major. And then when he gets into this corner, he says, let's speed up the harmonic rhythm. So we have chord 4, then we go straight to chord 2, and then we come back to this 5/7 again, using that thing in the melodic line that we had up here. So that's coming back again. You see, you've got that 5/7 with the accented passing note. And then this time turns it into a lower auxiliary note, a lower neighbour tone before it comes back up to the F. So just that change melodically there. And then you think, okay, he's just going to go G flat major, which is kind of logical. He doesn't quite do that. He does this. And then resolves to G flat major. So we're now looking at this corner. Now what's going on there? The left hand is absolutely spelling out the tonic and the dominant of the tonic chord of G flat major, but the right hand is all 5/7. So you see what he's doing is this kind of multiple appoggiatura thing, really, where you've got the whole of 5/7 in the right hand suspended over the tonic and dominant, and then you go, ah, and it all just absolutely relaxes into that cadence chord. And then you think, ah, perfect cadence, G flat major. The first time we've had a cadence that's finished on the tonic chord of G flat major. So you see how he's kind of using the tension of the harmony to enhance the impact of the melody. Okay, well, let's see what he does next, because life gets sort of quite interesting. Well, he starts on this D flat major chord where you're thinking, well, there's nothing too harmful about that. It's just the dominant chord. But where does he go? He goes on to this chord where you're thinking, oh, now then, if we're in G flat major, why have we got G naturals going on here? Well, this is a 5/7, a dominant seventh in the key of A flat in its second inversion. Now remember, these dominant sevenths could be A flat major, could be A flat minor. It turns out when he goes on to the next bar that we're heading for A flat minor. So you see that A flat minor situation there. And that's not too much of a surprise, is it, in the key of G flat major, because that's really chord 2, isn't it? So we've gone from 5/7 second inversion to 1 in A flat minor. It's a secondary dominant formula. But of course, you know, just to make it a bit more emotionally telling, do you see what he does in that melody? So we have this 5/7 and then he does this. So it's got a kind of a appoggiatura thing in it. You see that thing that's going 4/3 before it kind of sits down, and you go, ah, relief again. And then he picks up the tension in the harmony. We've finished on a C flat. We carry on a C flat. So when you hear that melodically, Okay, it finished C flat, it carries on C flat, what's the big surprise? But we've had that A flat minor chord, and then he does this. That's quite a bold kind of move, isn't it? Because you think, ooh, what was that? It's F flat major, if you don't mind. F flat major chord. So then you think, ooh, what's he doing now? So here's your F flat major. So this is when you can repeat a melody note. So that seems harmless enough, but you kind of dramatically change the chord. So we've had that A flat minor, suddenly we get F flat major. Then it's going on to C flat major. Now that begins to make more sense of the F flat major, because F flat major is chord 4 in C flat major. So then we go chord 1 in C flat major in first inversion, and now we're going to have a passing 6/4, because then it goes on to this 5/7C thing. So 5/7 second inversion, and then we're going on to a chord 1 in C flat major, which we eventually get to there. But again, he does this sort of 4/3 thing, you know, this appoggiatura thing, because he's working in sequence with the previous phrase. After that, things calm down a bit. We've got this chord 4, chord 2, and then a chord 5 onto a G flat major chord, and things are more settled. What I'm getting to is interesting to look at the melodic design to see how he puts that together, and then to see how it's supported by the harmonic design and by the harmonic rhythm, and also to notice when the melody is doing something quite plain, like repeating a note, while something quite dramatic and colourful happens in the harmony. So we've got to the point of thinking, yep, beginning to get the idea as to what he's doing melodically, beginning to get the idea of what he's doing harmonically and how those two things belong to each other. But in fact, if this piece were just that, it still wouldn't have all of its magic sparkle if I played it like this. It sounds quite nice, doesn't it? But it's a sort of bit hymn-like, isn't it? And it would soon kind of lose the interest of the listener. So what else goes on? Well, one thing is we've got a little bit of secondary melodic interest in the bass. I mean, I don't know if you noticed, but things like this corner in the bass are quite interesting, where the bass does this. That's actually quite interesting melodically. Most of the time the bass is the bass line, but just a little hint of something melodic creeping through in a secondary line. Subtle touch. But of course the big thing that we haven't talked about yet is what's going on in the middle of the texture. And instead of just giving us those block chords, Schubert has this kind of broken chord thing going on in the middle. So he takes these chords, he just breaks them up. That gives us a kind of rhythmic energy to the piece. And you've got this constant kind of rippling along of all these quavers, all these eighth notes, alongside this slow moving melody and this beautiful colour of the harmony that we're kind of soaking up as we go. So this is the most agile component, but it's giving us energy, it's driving things forwards, but it's not agitating the music, it's just kind of like rippling on the water. And it's when you put all of that together that you suddenly arrive at, wow, this is what really makes this piece work. So put it all together with that figuration, you get this. so on. What a gorgeous piece of music. Well, I hope that's just helped to unpack what's going on there and help us to think that, in fact, you can't just focus on one element of the music and say, this is what makes this work. I think it's really instructive for composers as well, because if you kind of go down one route of saying, I'm going to write this fantastic melody and then, well, I will just fill in the rest later, you've got to take this more integrated approach. And that's something we really learn from Schubert. What are we doing melodically? How is that supported harmonically? When are things happening in the harmony that slightly take us by surprise or change the colour while the melody is not particularly doing anything exciting? When the melody is doing something exciting, is that supported by the harmony sometimes? And what's going on with this kind of more incidental stuff, like that figuration in the middle that really adds the icing to the cake? Gorgeous piece of music and so instructive as well in the fantastic hands of Schubert. Well, if you've enjoyed this video, let me invite you to take a little journey to the Music Matters website, www.mmcourses.co.uk. Lots of things to look at there, but if you click on courses and you're interested in doing more of this kind of stuff that you've seen in this video in greater detail, have a look at our analysis courses. I mean, there's a Bach Prelude and Fugue that we take apart completely, one of the 48, and really explain what's going on in the Prelude and the Fugue. There's a Beethoven Pathetique Sonata where we're looking at every single movement of Beethoven's Pathetique and taking all these ingredients apart. So you not only learn about those pieces, but you learn how to analyze, how to spot things in the music that you might be playing, how to spot things that are going to empower you as a composer. So there's such a huge amount to be learned from analysis. It sounds boring and academic, but actually it's about getting inside the mind of these great composers and to see what we can discover about their music and what we can discover about writing our own music, if that's where we're coming from. It's all there, many other things besides. www.mmcourses.co.uk.